How much is a name worth? What if a name, the right name, could open any door, unlock any vault, and command the unwavering trust of the world's most powerful people? Imagine a man who was not born into legacy, but simply decided to wear it like a custom-made suit. This is the story of a phantom, a chameleon who charmed his way into the highest echelons of society, not with a weapon, but with a whisper and a well-told lie. He was a master of reinvention, a man who proved that in a world obsessed with appearance, reality is often just the most convincing performance. In the late 1990s, a new and enigmatic figure appeared in the exclusive social circles of the rich and famous. He was known by many names, but his most effective persona was Christophe Rocancourt, an alleged French scion of the legendary American dynasty. He moved with an effortless grace through the Hamptons, Hollywood, and the penthouses of Manhattan. He spoke of family compounds and international finance with an easy familiarity that dispelled any doubt. He was charming, sophisticated, and possessed an almost supernatural confidence that drew people into his orbit like moths to a flame. He was, by all appearances, the real deal. The crime was not a single event, but a continuous, elaborate performance. The man behind the mask was Christophe Rocancourt, and his scheme was a masterpiece of social engineering. He didn't break into vaults, he was given the keys. He convinced sophisticated investors, actors, and socialites to give him money for phantom business deals, promising them astronomical returns. He would borrow vast sums from one new friend to maintain his lavish lifestyle in front of another, creating a dazzling but fragile illusion of immense wealth that was always just one day away from collapsing. His method was audacious in its simplicity. He understood that the super-rich often operate in a world of assumed trust and are more concerned with social standing than with due diligence. He would name-drop other celebrities, claiming people like Jean-Claude Van Damme or Mickey Rourke were his close associates, and often they were, for a time. He would pay for extravagant dinners and charter private jets, using money he had just acquired from his latest victim. He was a master of using his target's own ambition and greed against them, knowing they wanted to be associated with a Rockefeller more than they wanted to check his credentials. The investigation into Christophe Rockefeller was, for years, an exercise in frustration. It was like trying to catch smoke. His victims were often powerful people who were too embarrassed to admit they had been swindled by a con man. Reporting the crime would mean admitting their own gullibility to the world. Furthermore, Rocancourt was a ghost. He operated under a dozen different aliases, each with its own backstory and network of contacts. When one identity became too risky, he would simply shed it like a snakeskin and re-emerge elsewhere as someone new. The key challenge for law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, was connecting the dots between a string of seemingly unrelated frauds. A bad real estate deal in Los Angeles, a soured investment in New York, a massive unpaid hotel bill in Switzerland. They all seemed like isolated incidents. The perpetrator left very little in the way of a traditional paper trail. He dealt in cash, promises, and the powerful currency of his charisma. The police were hunting for a sophisticated criminal, but they couldn't even agree on what he looked like or what his real name was. Rocancourt's targets weren't just the foolish or the naive. He preyed on the intelligent and the cynical, people who believed they were too smart to be conned. He would often surround himself with a small entourage of legitimate, if starstruck, individuals, which added to his credibility. He once convinced a former Playboy model to marry him, further cementing his place in the social hierarchy. His deception was a work of art, a carefully constructed narrative that was so compelling, so detailed, that even those who had their doubts wanted to believe it was true. The con artist's mind is a unique and complex place. For Rocancourt, it was never just about the money. The money was simply the fuel required to maintain the illusion. The real prize was the life itself, the power, the access, the adoration. He was born into poverty in Honfleur, France, the son of a prostitute and an alcoholic painter who abandoned him. His entire life was a reaction to that origin, a desperate and brilliant attempt to erase his past by creating a present so dazzling that no one would ever think to look behind the curtain. The international scope of his crimes made him an elusive target. If the heat got too intense in the United States, he would flee to Canada or Europe, reinventing himself along the way. He had a knack for finding people in moments of vulnerability, an actress looking for her next big break, a businessman on the verge of bankruptcy, and presenting himself as their savior. He didn't just sell them an investment, he sold them a dream, a vision of a better future that he and only he could provide. His charm was his most effective weapon. The first cracks in his carefully constructed facade began to appear not because of a brilliant piece of detective work, but because of his own growing arrogance. Living the high life is expensive, and Rocancourt's web of debt was becoming increasingly tangled. He was juggling more and more victims, his stories becoming more elaborate and harder to maintain. A bounced check here, an unreturned phone call there. Small inconsistencies began to pile up, and a few of his victims started quietly comparing notes, realizing they had been told the same fantastic stories. One of his most brazen cons involved selling a property in the Hamptons that he didn't own. He had simply been renting the lavish estate and presented it as his own to a group of potential investors. He collected substantial down payments before vanishing, leaving the investors with nothing but a worthless contract. This act was so audacious that it finally triggered a serious, multi-agency investigation. The police now had a clear pattern of high-value fraud, and the name Rockefeller was at the center of it. The pressure was mounting, but Rocancourt was a master of escape. When the FBI began closing in on him in New York, he fled to the West Coast, reinventing himself as a film producer and ingratiating himself with Hollywood's elite. He lived with Mickey Rourke for a time and was known to party with Dodie Fade. He was always moving, always networking, always one step ahead of the law. He was a social predator, and the circles of the rich and famous were his hunting ground. The investigation became a global manhunt, with Interpol issuing a notice for his arrest. The list of his known aliases grew longer: Fabien Ortuno, Prince de Galitzine, Christopher Reyes. Each name was a key to a different life, a different set of victims. Investigators painstakingly pieced together his movements, tracking his financial transactions, and interviewing a growing list of people who had been touched by his deception. They were no longer just investigating a fraud. They were deconstructing a life built entirely on lies. The breakthrough finally came in April 2001, not in the glamorous hotspots of New York or LA, but in the quiet town of Whistler, British Columbia. Rocancourt had fled to Canada with his wife at the time, Playboy model Pia Reyes, and their son. There, he had assumed the identity of a race car driver and was attempting to con a local businessman. However, the Canadian authorities were on alert. A routine background check connected his alias to the international warrant issued by Interpol. The confrontation was ironically mundane. A team of Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers surrounded his residence and arrested him. The great Christophe Rocancourt, the man who had charmed millions out of the global elite, was taken into custody without a fight. The mask was finally ripped away. In the sterile environment of a police station, stripped of his designer clothes and his entourage, he was revealed to be nothing more than Christophe Rocancourt, a 33-year-old fugitive from a poor village in Normandy. The immediate aftermath of his arrest was a media firestorm. The story of the French Rockefeller was sensational. His victims, now that he was caught, began to come forward, their stories a mix of anger, shame, and a strange, lingering fascination with the man who had duped them. The case exposed the startling lack of security and the blind trust that operated within the world of high finance and celebrity, a world Rocancourt had exploited with surgical precision. Rocancourt faced a mountain of charges in both Canada and the United States. He was implicated in scams totaling an estimated $40 million, though the true figure is likely much higher. In Canada, he pleaded guilty to defrauding a businessman. He was then extradited to New York to face a battery of charges including theft, grand larceny, smuggling, bribery, and perjury. The chameleon was finally caged, his performance seemingly at an end. His trial in New York was a spectacle. He charmed the reporters, presenting himself as a kind of Robin Hood figure who only stole from the rich and greedy. He showed little remorse, framing his life as a grand adventure, a work of performance art. He pleaded guilty to a handful of the charges in a deal with prosecutors. In 2003, he was sentenced to 5 years in U.S. federal prison. The court also ordered him to pay over $1 million in restitution, a sum he would likely never be able to repay. Even in prison, Rocancourt's manipulative charm continued to work. He reportedly ran scams on the inside and was known for his ability to talk his way into special privileges. His story was a testament to the fact that his power was never in a name or a bank account, but in his profound understanding of human psychology. He knew what people wanted: wealth, status, validation, and he knew how to reflect those desires back at them, making himself appear to be the key to all their dreams. Upon his release from prison in 2005, he was immediately deported back to France. But if the world thought he would fade into obscurity, they had once again underestimated Christophe Rocancourt. For most criminals, deportation is the end of the story. For Rocancourt, it was the beginning of his third act. He arrived in France not as a disgraced criminal, but as a national celebrity, a folk hero who had outsmarted the American elite. The legacy of Christophe Rocancourt is not one of a common criminal, but of a master performer who never left the stage. Back in France, he published a best-selling autobiography, Christophe Rocancourt, Orphan, Playboy, Convict, which was later made into a film. He became a regular guest on television talk shows, a media personality who was famous for being famously infamous. He had successfully conned his entire country into seeing him as a lovable rogue. His story highlights a dark truth about our society. We are often more fascinated by the con than we are angered by the crime, especially when the victims are wealthy. Rocancourt's life became a parable about class, ambition, and the illusion of identity. He was the poor boy who infiltrated the castle, and in a strange way, people admired him for it. He had achieved the ultimate con. He had turned his own criminal history into a profitable and celebrated brand. Yet the mind of a con artist is rarely at peace. The compulsion to perform to deceive is a powerful one. Despite his fame and newfound legitimacy, Rocancourt could not escape his old habits. In the years following his return to France, he was implicated in a number of other scandals and scams, from peddling fake documents to being involved in a high-profile corruption case. The performance, it seemed, was the only life he knew. What drove him? Was it a desire for revenge against a world that had dealt him a bad hand at birth? Was it a form of addiction, a need for the adrenaline rush of the high-stakes life? Or was it something deeper, a man so hollowed out by his childhood that he could only feel real when he was pretending to be someone else? The true motive likely lies in a complex mix of all three, the psychological profile of a man who built a kingdom on thin air. His story is a powerful cautionary tale about the nature of trust. He was able to succeed because his victims suspended their disbelief. They saw the Rockefeller name and the lavish lifestyle, and their critical thinking simply shut down. He exploited the fact that people see what they want to see. His success is an indictment not just of him, but of a culture that values the appearance of success over the substance of character. He demonstrated that the most secure systems in the world, banks, corporations, high society, all have a single exploitable flaw: the human element. He didn't hack computers or crack safes. He hacked people. He used charm, confidence, and a deep understanding of social dynamics to bypass every security measure imaginable. He was a social hacker, and his targets never even knew their defenses had been breached until it was far too late. The countless victims he left in his wake are a testament to the real damage his victimless crimes caused. Many lost their life savings, their businesses, and their reputations. His charm was a destructive force, a whirlwind that lifted people up with promises only to leave them broken when it passed. Behind the glamorous headlines and the celebrity anecdotes lies a trail of very real human suffering, the collateral damage of one man's elaborate fantasy. Even today, the name Christophe Rocancourt evokes a sense of grudging admiration, alongside condemnation. He is the ultimate imposter, the man who proved that with enough audacity, you can be anyone you want to be. His life story reads like a Hollywood script, which is perhaps why he was so successful there. He understood that life, like a movie, is about telling a good story, and his was one of the most unbelievable stories ever told. The mind of the con artist is a labyrinth of ambition, narcissism, and a profound emptiness. They create elaborate worlds because their own reality is unbearable. Rocancourt's entire life was an act of creation, but the foundation was hollow. He could wear the mask of a Rockefeller, but he could never escape the reality of the abandoned boy from Honfleur. The glamour was always just a cover for the pain. His story serves as a timeless reminder of the power of deception. In an age of social media, where identities are curated and lives are performed for an online audience, the lessons of his life are more relevant than ever. He was a master of personal branding long before the term was coined, a pioneer of crafting an image so perfect that it became its own reality. He understood that if you control the narrative, you control the world. And so, the legacy of Christophe Rocancourt leaves us with a deeply unsettling question. In a world increasingly built on surfaces, on images, and on the stories we tell about ourselves, how can we ever be sure who is real? The greatest con artists don't just take your money, they take your sense of certainty. They leave you wondering if everyone, to some extent, is playing a part, and if the reality we trust is just the most convincing performance of all.